Okay, so in this panel, we're going to talk about some of the changes going on in the regulatory environment, both here in the US and overseas. We have three distinguished panelists. Dr. Kristen Welle from University of, is it Welle or Welly?
It's Welly.
Sorry. Dr. Kristen Welly from the University of Colorado, Denver, as is detailed in the bio in the handouts, former FDA regulatory science person. Nick Langhals from the NIH is the neural engineering program manager. And Victor Peikoff just recently left Galvani and is now the CEO of a startup called Metapace. He's going to talk a little bit about the Chinese market and some of the regulatory issues in that marketplace.
Good morning, everybody. I just have a few slides that I'm going to go through pretty quickly. I am going to give a bit of an overview of FDA regulations and their recent changes, and a little bit on EU as well, slight comparison. Some of this may be old news to many of you in the room. I have included a little bit of background for those who are slightly less familiar, but I won't belabor the points. So to start with the current landscape, and this is the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. So the current landscape in US and EU regulation, this is an overview, a summary of sort of the FDA regulatory pathway. You have the main regulatory pathways, 510K, de novo, HDE, and PMA. EU is different, and what you can, I think, immediately appreciate is it's simpler. In the EU system, typically there's one pathway, and that is the CE mark. These are given out by notified bodies. These are private for-profit organizations. There are over 70 of them across EU countries, and there is some oversight of these notified bodies by what's called competent authorities, with a bit of limited post-market surveillance. In 2012, the FDA released a somewhat snarky report called Unsafe and Ineffective Devices Approved in the EU that were not approved in the US. They list a number of devices that were ultimately recalled, but also in this report they give a pretty reasonable overview of the differences between the US and EU systems. Essentially, these changes boil down to, while both systems require proof of safety, US requires efficacy or effectiveness, whereas EU mainly requires technical performance for the CE mark. US typically requires more extensive clinical trials, and there's a centralized authority, whereas in EU, different notified bodies may deal slightly differently with applications. There's a lot of transparency, or a reasonable amount of transparency in the FDA system. There are databases with all of the authorizations or the approvals or clearances and recalls, and that is not provided in EU, in the EU system, not even when there has been a safety recall. So in general, it boils down to the criticisms of each system. Criticism of the EU is that it doesn't collect as much data on safety and effectiveness, and of course the criticism of FDA is that the process is burdensome and time-consuming, resource-intensive. So is there really a difference in safety between these two processes? That's unsettled, but there is some research out there that honestly, it goes both ways. So this study released by BCG in 2011, it's a little bit older. It looked at class 1 recalls and found no difference between the EU and FDA. Of course, this data is difficult to obtain, and because the EU does not have a lot of transparency, so there's always a little bit of question as to how reliable the data is. In 2016, there was another study that came out looking at both the time to approval, and as expected, the time for PMA supplements and HDE level submissions was significantly shorter under the EU system as compared to FDA, whereas for 510Ks it was sort of a toss-up. There wasn't a meaningful difference in the time to approval. This is a cumulative probability of the incidence of safety alerts and recalls, and here the blue line is EU and the red line is US, and so there appear to be more safety alerts and recalls on EU cleared products. So that is some of the data. I think it remains to be seen which system is actually creating greater safety for patients in terms of the balance, especially with in light of balance with innovation and access to devices. However, the landscape here is changing. You see some beautiful changing mountains. So for instance, Jim presented this great slide on recent FDA approvals in the last year, and there's a number of different strategies for some of these different devices. So for instance, for the Remedy system, they had sort of maybe a more traditional strategy. They got a CE mark in 2010. They did their feasibility and pivotal studies in both the US and other countries, so it was multi-site, multi-center studies for their PMA. Similarly, for the BrainsWay TMS for depression, CE roughly 2010, I couldn't quite find the date. Australian approval 2015. Did their mixture of US and abroad for their studies, and then finally got de novo approval in 2018. For the LivaNova Sentiva system, this was a PMA supplement, and they got both the CE mark and the PMA supplement in 2018, so roughly at the same time period. And another example is CalaHealth for their essential tremor device. They did their pivotal trial in the US and got a de novo, and to my knowledge, maybe someone here can correct me, I don't think they have a CE mark, although please tell me if I'm wrong. I couldn't find one. Couldn't find evidence of one. So, different strategies here. Not everyone is taking the same sort of CE mark first, and outside of the US strategies first. One of the reasons is that there have been some recent changes in getting IDEs approved here in the US. So this graph is showing from 2011 to 2015, the average number of days to full IDE approval. In 2011, it was 442 days, and in 2015, the average is 30 days, which is the review cycle for IDEs. So it has sped up quite a bit, and this remains true in 2018. The average number of cycles is 1.06, which basically means 30 plus a couple of days. So IDEs are pretty rapidly approved. Sorry, let's go. Something got blocked out there. Okay, I had a list of the reasons. Why is that? A few reasons. There is now a clinical trials director, Owen Ferris. If a IDE is disapproved, he becomes immediately involved in the review of that IDE for the most part. So there's been a push. His position was created as a part of the strategic priorities that FDA laid out, or CDRH laid out from 2012 to 2017, which one of the priorities was to streamline clinical trials approvals. There was also the FDASIA regulation in 2012 that said that you could no longer disapprove an IDE on the basis of efficacy. Instead, it had to be just for safety concerns. So you have to have a safety concern to disapprove an IDE. And then, of course, the early feasibility study program, which I hope everyone here is aware of. This is a really potent program for getting early studies started, and the idea here is that you can defer testing until after you've completed your first in-human trials. Also, I have up here pre-submissions. Pre-submission is now a MDUFA-reported outcome, which means that the FDA is responsible for how long it takes them to get pre-submission feedback. So in 2018, the average feedback took place within 60 days, which was their target goal. So there is some accountability now. Okay, so IDs are looking a little better. What about actual approvals or clearances? That's not quite as encouraging. This is a chart looking at the average time to PMA approval, or decisions rather. And this is 91% of the cases closed, so most of the cohort is finished. Maybe a little bit of a downward trend, but not what you might call a really compelling success story yet. It does take a couple of years for these numbers to adjust because the PMA process is so long, so potentially there could be better outcomes in the future. 510Ks are pretty stable. They're right above 90 days, around 100. Well, yeah, it depends on what time you're looking at, but they're pretty stable. There hasn't been a huge shift in the time to decision. A little bit better for de novos. This is for de novos here. This is 2010 down to 2016. There's been quite a drop in the amount of time. Still, it's at, I think that's 269 calendar days, so it's still not a quick process, but it is a little bit better. The Breakthrough Devices Program, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, this was preceded by the Expedited Access Program, the Priority Review Program, the Innovation Pathway. Megan is here, very involved in that. This has been sort of bundled together into a Breakthrough Devices Program, which hopefully should further accelerate some of these approvals. Okay, so that's sort of the lay of the land for CDRH. For the EU, whoops. So the EU is undergoing some major changes as well. They have in the past been under what's called medical device directives that laid out the CE mark pathway. They are switching to medical device regulations. This will be fully implemented in 2020. The regulations were passed in 2017. What changes? There is going to be stricter pre-market review with more clinical evidence of safety and effectiveness needed. There will be greater oversight of the notified bodies, and there will finally be a little more transparency. There will be a database for tracking medical devices. There will be a unique identifier that will be required. And this sort of repeating the earlier point, there will be reinforcing the rules for clinical evidence. So essentially requiring more clinical evidence for the CE mark. And finally, they will have strengthened regulations for post-market surveillance and also increased transparency for post-market reporting. So essentially, it seems as though the FDA has been trying to sort of bring the bar down at least a touch, at least in terms of IDEs, and maybe for some the breakthrough devices as well. Whereas the EU is going a little bit in the opposite direction. Seems unlikely that they will. Well, I don't know. It doesn't seem that even with these regulatory changes that they'll become equivalent. It will still probably be faster to get a CE mark, but there is a little bit of shift in the opposite directions.